Stanford University.
Hi everyone, welcome to Spring for the People, Computers, and Design seminar. I'm really excited today for our speaker, Teresa Amabile, who is one of the world's foremost researchers on creativity. And I'm really thankful that she was able to come and join us. A couple of months ago, in one of our research meetings, we were looking at Teresa's work. And my students and I said, well, why don't we just invite Teresa to come to the HCI seminar? And when you invite somebody from out of field we hadn't met in person before, I had no idea what response I would get. I assume, as you can see from her bio, she's incredibly busy, and I figured, well, no way am I going to hear back. She's got too many things to do. And while she has many things to do, she was kind enough to respond and say that she'd love to come. And we're really great to have her today. Let me tell you a few things about her work, and then for the students in the class, I'll tell you some of the administrative details. Teresa is the Edsel Bryant Ford Professor of Business Administration at Harvard. She got her PhD here in psychology, working with Mark Lepper and Lee Ross. And she's spent several decades now studying creativity, originally in individuals and more recently in organizations. And many of the ideas that she's going to talk about today are, we'll put one here for the camera, and I'll show you one of these. This is her latest book with her husband and collaborator, Steve Kramer. And so I encourage all of you to buy this book and support Teresa's work. For students taking the class, the details are online. There's a sign-up sheet that goes around. Our TA this quarter is Jesse Ciramelli, who is right there in the blue shirt. And so make sure you sign the sign-up sheet and read the details about taking the class for credit. And thank you so much for coming, Teresa. It's really wonderful to have you here.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. I always love coming back to Stanford, and it's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. I am excited to tell you about a longitudinal research program, much of which recently wrapped up, and it's in the book, The Progress Principle. But one of the things that I wanted to ask of you, and I hope that we will have time for Q&A and discussion at the end, and also you can feel free to jump in with questions throughout the presentation. You'll see that we have a very large and I think somewhat unique database. Actually, I shouldn't say very large database in a room like this, right? We have what we consider, what is in psychology considered a large database, which we have not by any means exhausted. There's a lot more that we could do with it, and I would love to get your ideas on interesting hypotheses to test or directions that we might be able to take with this database that I'm going to describe to you. I do want to acknowledge the many collaborators I've had over the several years of this research. Steve, whom Scott mentioned, is here, and he's my main co-author and collaborator, but I've had many collaborators over the last several years, including most recently Juliana Pillemer, my current research associate at Harvard Business School. Juliana, I saw you walk in a minute ago. Where are you? Okay, Juliana's back there. I'm happy to have you here as well, Juliana. So this research addressed a number of specific questions having to do with subjective experience at work. You know, what do people experience at work? What makes people happy, motivated, productive, and creative at work? I'm going to address a few specific questions from this research in today's talk. I have no idea if I will get to all of these, but here are the basic research questions. How does inner work life influence performance? And inner work life is our term for day-by-day subjective experience, psychological experience. And it includes affective or emotional experience. It includes cognition. It includes motivation as well. We focus in particular on intrinsic motivation, which is the motivation to do something because it is interesting, enjoyable, satisfying, personally challenging to the individual, which we have found in previous research is the optimal motivational state for creativity. So that's the first research question. I'm going to be spending most of my time on that one. The second research question has to do with what actually influences day-by-day psychological state at work. What kinds of specific events make a difference for people? The third research question was actually a follow-up after the main research was done. What we discovered in retrospect seems a little bit obvious, and we want to know if it is obvious to people who manage organizations. So we did a follow-up survey that I'll hopefully spend a few minutes on if we have some time toward the end. The basic research approach that we took included using both qualitative data and quantitative data, and I'll describe a little bit about both of those kinds of data that we had. The core of the data was a set of daily diaries, nearly 12,000 individual daily diary entries that we collected from professionals working inside organizations on creative projects. That is, projects that required novelty as well as feasibility in order to be considered successful as their outcome.
Teresa, were these computer or paper?
These were electronic daily diaries that we kept confidential to our research team. So it was something that we hoped would allow people an avenue for really telling us the truth about what they were experiencing every day and what kinds of events were going on in their projects, in their teams. So we had a number of other data sources besides the daily diaries. I'll describe a little bit of this, but the diaries made up the core of the data that we had. And feel free to ask clarification questions like this as we go along. The aims that we had were both simple and very ambitious, and that is to explore microscopically the phenomenology of everyday work life, as I said. We wanted to go beyond the limitations of experiments, which are nicely controlled, but actually, have a lot of problems in terms of ecological validity. Interview studies and other retrospective survey studies have other problems in terms of experimental demand, interviewer demand characteristics, as well as retrospective bias. We thought if we could actually get a window into people's day-by-day subjective experience close to real time when they experience these events, we could do a better job of understanding what unfolds inside organizations and what determines how people experience their days, as well as whether and how it influences their performance. I should say, in relation to those research questions that I had up here a minute ago, this is non-experimental research. We cannot definitively nail causality in any of this. I think we can come close in some of what we did to looking at directional causality or possible causality by looking at the direction of effects. But to nail this, we, of course, need experiments, which we're now beginning to do inside organizations. And we also want to look at not only the specific antecedents in terms of events at work that influence inner work life, this psychological experience, but also what the consequences were for performance. Let me tell you a little bit about the diary database. So we had 238 individual professionals in 26 creative project teams in 7 companies in 3 industries. So we had high-tech, consumer products, and chemicals as the 3 industries that we sampled from. As I mentioned, these were creative projects, and that is not the outcome. That is what the outcome was supposed to be. We studied these projects from as close as we could get to the beginning to as close as we could get to the end. So we assumed if we had a number of different projects, some of them actually would yield creative, innovative results, and some of them would be unsuccessful. And we were hoping to be able to explain at least some of that variability, especially variability in individuals' performance on these teams, as a function of their psychological experience and the events that they were experiencing in their day-by-day work. So these were electronic diaries that we collected by sending out an email to everyone participating in the study around midday to early afternoon, asking them to fill out the survey just before they left work, or as close as they could get to just before they left work, about that particular day. Yeah?
For these daily diaries, did you use a technique to try to help them reconstruct their day or help them make it more real, like remember more about the day, or did you just allow them to remember whatever they wanted?
We actually did a training session, so this was very hands-on. We realized that in order to get people to spend the 5 to 10 minutes a day that it would take for them to do this daily diary, we would have to have them feel like they were not only subjects in a psychological study, but that they were partners in the research enterprise. So I met individually with every team that we were trying to recruit for the study, talking to them about what we were trying to look at. I should make it clear, we did not indicate that we were looking specifically at creativity. And I think that's important because you'll be able to get a sense of how we got unobtrusive measures of creativity. We helped them to feel like they were involved with us. We actually met with them a number of times. I went in to meet with them after the team decided as a team that they wanted to be involved in the study. I went back and trained them in how to do a daily diary that would give us really good data every day. We did not give them a day reconstruction technique, but we did actually start out the survey with a number of quantitative measures of their emotions, their perceptions or judgments of the day, and their motivational state for the day. We then asked them, to me, what was the key question. Oh, by the way, we started out with a very short, open-ended question, which was, tell us what you did today. That was partly for us to get a sense of how much concrete progress people were making in their work, and we knew the nature of the work that each individual was supposed to be doing on the project. But we also wanted to allow them an opportunity to kind of dump from their memory what they had done that day, so that when they got to what we considered the most important question, they wouldn't simply talk about what they had done. And the key question, I think I have it on the slide, was describe an event that stands out in your mind from the day that is in any way relevant to the work, your individual work, or to this project. So we said briefly describe it, but give us as much concrete detail as you can. So try to clearly remember it. So this is what I told them when we were training them. Try to very clearly remember the event of the day, and it can be anything at all, from an event that happened between your own ears to something within the team, something in the organization, even something with someone outside the organization, as long as it's relevant to the work. Tell us what happened, who was involved, and as much detail as you can reconstruct about it. And then we actually had them practice writing event descriptions in the training. So does that address your issue, Jesse? Okay. We did get pretty detailed, concrete event descriptions from, I can't say everyone, but from many people who participated in the study. And we had a number of other measures besides the daily diary, including peer and supervisor ratings of performance. So this is key. We had subjective assessments from supervisors and from coworkers periodically on creativity, productivity, demonstrated commitment to the work, and collegiality as the basic performance measures that we were looking at. And I'll describe a quasi-behavioral measure of creativity that we got from the diaries themselves. We had many individual difference measures as well. We collected personality scores on these individuals. We had them actually fill out a standard personality questionnaire, demographic information, background information, organizational tenure, that kind of thing. And we had a lot of information about the projects and each individual's role in the project as well. Terry, did you have a question? Okay. So, there was something else. Oh, and we ended up with nearly 12,000 of these individual daily diary reports. We got what I think is a fairly astonishing 75% response rate. And I think that that's partly attributable to the fact that we did try to keep these people engaged in the research. Most of these projects, well, on average, the projects lasted 19 weeks. That's a very long time, I think, to ask people to respond to an everyday Monday through Friday survey, especially when you know what typical response rates are for a one-time administration of a survey. So we feel pretty good about being able to get good coverage on these projects. We ask the individuals on these teams to not talk to each other about what they were reporting. We wanted to be able to triangulate on the events that were occurring in these teams, in these organizations, in these projects. Yes, question?
I'm wondering, did you consider gathering feedback at the beginning of the day to kind of measure someone's expected progress so that that might, affect how they evaluate, throughout the day?
That's a really great question. And I think if I were, well, I don't know if I mean this, but I'll say it. If I were to do this again, I might actually try to get some measure like that, because it was really interesting to note that many of these diary entries did say something about, when I started the day, I thought I would do X, or X plus X prime plus this plus that, and this is what I actually ended up doing. So it would have been really interesting, I think, to get assessment of that. I would love to have been able to get beginning of the day assessments of affect too, right? Emotionality or mood, to be able to look at really what happened during the day and how it affected the individual. But I say I'm not sure I would do that because it took a lot of work for us to get the 75% rate, just asking people to do this once a day. And we tested this on ourselves. My research team and I actually forced ourselves to do this for a few weeks before we rolled it out to a large, and by the research team, I mean we had several practitioners and organizations help us test this out. It's kind of a pain to do it every day, once a day. So I don't know if twice a day would be realistic. Yes? Scott?
I was curious how you got such a high response rate, what your intuition is. And I'm curious whether you think that these responses played a therapeutic role in people's work.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason that we did get a high response rate. I think that people initially did it the first couple of weeks because they had made a commitment to us to do it. And I think it was very important that they met us face to face. I know it is so much easier now to use, Mechanical Turk or whatever else to get subjects participating in your research that you never see. And they never see you. There's no human connection. I believe that our response rate would have been lousy if we had not actually made a personal connection. I still remember what many of these 238 people looked like. And I think that connection was important for the kind of data we were trying to collect. We wanted to get very personal data from these people every day. So I think that was a big part of it. Also, we promised them a workshop for each team that participated at the end of our data collection. So if their project was 5 months long, we said, in the 6th month, we will come back, show you preliminary data that we collected from your team, and engage you in a workshop-style discussion of what happened during this project, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, our perspective on what was going on, what happened, what affected you, and we'll talk about how you might be able to work more effectively as a team in the future. And I think that these people believed that they would be able to get a window into themselves as individuals and a window into their team and how effective it was, that kept them going as well. After a couple of weeks of doing this, a number of people, and they reported this to us at the end, discovered that it was useful to them. They would say something like, it was sort of a pain to have to do this every day, but I realized that I never give myself reflection time at the end of the day. But this forced me to do that, and I began to see patterns in my work or in the work of the team. I began to see patterns in my own reactions to things that I think helped me do better. On the one hand, that obviously influenced our results. And we don't have a control group that wasn't doing the daily diary reports. But I think it's very interesting, and this is actually something we're following up on experimentally now, to look at the effect of daily self-reflection on people's motivational state and emotional state and so on. Was there another question? Okay. I'm going to move on. So let me give you this basic framework for thinking about inner work life, and this kind of maps out what we did in the study as well as what we ended up finding in the study. So the basic idea is that a workday event happens, and as soon as it happens, people begin to react to it emotionally, and they begin to try to make sense of it. So there are affective reactions, emotional reactions, and there's some kind of sense-making that goes on, cognition, even if it's not the level of, complete conscious cognition. And that those emotions and cognitions interact and influence each other, and together they both influence motivational state. And that complex, that confluence of what we call inner work life influences the individual's approach to the work, influences performance, so that you can actually, we hypothesized that we would be able to see day-by-day variation in performance as a function of inner work life, which would at least in part be a function of specific events that the individuals were experiencing at work. So let me get to the first research question, which is the relationship between emotion and creativity. And that's a research question that looks at a part of this model, right? So positive, negative emotional state, overall mood, how does that relate to creativity, which is one of the 4 aspects of performance that we assessed in this study. Let me give you a little bit of theoretical background on this. So in 1960, Campbell wrote a very influential and somewhat controversial paper called Blind Variation and Selective Retention in Creative Thought. It was essentially a Darwinian view of creativity, that creativity requires a high volume of ideas and a wide variety of ideas, and that it's almost random variation, and then selective retention of the ideas that look like they're going to work afterwards. Dean Simonton elaborated on this model in his 1999 book, Origins of Genius. And I recommend that you take a look at that because it's a very interesting and quite influential theory of creativity. And it is generally accepted now that, yes, for creativity to happen, there does need to be a wide variation of associations made. The next piece of theory that we're building on, and empirical evidence, is the connection between positive affect or positive emotionality and creativity. Alice Eisen and her students for decades have been doing experiments showing that if you put people into a positive affective state experimentally by having something nice happen to them in the laboratory, they are more likely to produce unusual associations and actually do better on standard creativity tasks than those who are in a neutral emotional state or a negative emotional state. And there's non-experimental work on this as well, but most of it is experimental inside the laboratory showing causality. However, there is also some empirical evidence showing a connection between negative affect and creativity. Not a lot, but there is some. And there's quite a bit of theory on this. Some of it comes from non-experimental work in psychopathology. Some of you may be familiar with Kay Jamison's work. She has found that there is a statistically significant higher incidence of certain forms of psychopathology in certain kinds of creative populations. In particular, creative writers and creative artists are more prone toward depression, okay, which is a negative affective state in general. And she's also found a little bit of evidence that they may do their most creative work when coming out of the depressive state. Okay, so there's that, which looks like it's not in the direction of positive affect leading to creativity, or at least not obviously. And there was a theory proposed in organizational psychology several years ago called the mood as input model, which proposed that if you are in a negative mood, that suggests to you that something is not right. And if you're in a situation where you're supposed to be doing creative work and you're in a negative mood, that could suggest that you need to work harder. And that could actually promote higher levels of creativity. So this theory hasn't been extensively tested, but there is some empirical evidence that this may hold under at least certain sets of circumstances. Terry?
Yeah, so a hypothesis comes from what you said, which is it's not level of affect, it's change of affect. So
Yeah.
if the laboratory experiment makes you happier than when you came in, that's a change positive, and if you get out of your depression, that also is.
Right, and we tried to look at this with the data that we collected in the diary study. We actually tried to look at change in affective state as a predictor of creativity. Okay, so we had a number of goals in this study. I think I've actually already tipped my hand at some of these. We basically wanted to look at the nature of the link between affect and creativity. Is it positive? Is it negative? And that was a very simple form of the question. We also wanted to look more specifically at the form of the relationship. So is it a simple linear relationship? Might there be a curvilinear component? And there's some suggestion that people actually are most efficient cognitively at moderate levels of arousal. So maybe at very, very extreme levels of negative affect or positive affect, we would find lower levels of creativity, and creativity might be highest at sort of intermediate ranges of affect. Another possibility is that it is the extreme emotional states, either one, that will lead to higher levels of creativity. There's a little bit of theoretical literature suggesting that that might be the case. There is some literature suggesting that ambivalence might lead to higher levels of creativity. There was a dissertation about 6 or 7 years ago suggesting that when people are in an ambivalent state about something, they may be more likely to come up with novel ideas. And Rothenberg did some interesting experiments in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s showing that if you give people seemingly incompatible ideas to hold in their mind at the same time, they may be more likely to come up with creative ideas in a completely different domain, interestingly enough. So we thought, well, is it possible that people will be most likely to be creative if they experience both positive and negative affect on the same day? So we looked at that, and we also looked at emotional lability, which is really what Terry was talking about. Is it possible that people will be most likely to be creative if they were, for example, in a negative mood state on one day, and then on the next day they're in a positive mood state? The K. Jameson idea. We want to look at the temporal dynamics of the relationship, assuming there is one, between affect and creativity. So does affect function as an antecedent? The experimental research would suggest yes. Might it also function as a consequence of creativity? Might it function as a concomitant? So that when people are doing creative work, when they're at their peak of creativity, they are more likely to be emotional, to experience either a positive or negative affective state. And ultimately, we were hoping to be able to begin to develop a comprehensive theory of affect and creativity at work. We had affect measures, several of them that we got from the diaries. We had self-rated positive mood. So on every daily diary form, and the form was the same every day, we asked people to just rate on a 7-point scale, how happy they were that day, how frustrated they were, and so on. So we had a number of measures of affect that were scale rated. We also had coders, 2 different sets of coders, go through all of the diary stories that these people wrote, the narratives, the event descriptions, to code every specific event that people described in the day's story, coded in a number of different ways, but one of the codings that was done was whether each segment had positive or negative affect attached to it. And we looked at emotion words as well as punctuation and sort of the general context for that. So the coder rated positive mood was an aggregation from the day's diary of the different segments of affect. We also had a second group of coders go through and code the specific basic emotions in each diary. So these are the 5 basic emotions. And by love, I don't so much mean romantic love here. We saw a little bit of that in these diaries, but not much. This was mostly a sense of warmth for oneself or one's coworkers, a sense of pride. We coded in this love category. Let me give you some examples of these diary stories. So this is an example of one that was coded as high. Chimney, did you have a question?
Yeah, but
Okay. Our strategic partner came through with a proposal that was much better than anticipated. Wow, we did better at negotiations last week than I thought. Okay. Here's an example. By the way, this is shorter than average. The average diary entry was something like 55 words. The range was 1 word up to 895 words. Here's an example of high anger. During the meeting with corporate, legal, and outside counsel, an attorney walked into the meeting unannounced and started acting like he had some value. Our internal legal staff are weak, and he was obviously there to ensure that we wouldn't go 100% outside. He ticked me off trying to control the meeting they had no business attending. I'm sure that only the bottom 1/3 of the graduating class in law school become internal patent lawyers. So that's an example of anger. So let me tell you about our did you want to answer your question now?
Yeah, sure. So it seems like you have high correlation between people's reported affect and the affect that's coded in the events. So it seems that, so I'm trying to understand whether people are majorly influenced by the event and thus have affect, or have affect in the report, or is it the other way around? Do you have any ideas for which way you found it to go?
Well, of course, given the nature of the data we have, I can't say which it is. We asked people to describe the event of the day at the end of the questionnaire, hoping that we would get, just their general sense of their happiness during the day and their frustration during the day before they actually focused on the event that they were going to report. So we were hoping that it would be sort of in the direction of, just in general how they were feeling, and then reporting the event rather than having the event shape what they said about their affect. In practice, we can't tell. We don't know which it was. So the creativity measures, we had daily creative thought, which we got from coding what people wrote about in the diaries. We didn't tell anyone that this study was focusing on creativity. I was really heartened to see that Kahneman and his colleagues wrote a paper a few years ago arguing that end-of-day reports of what people had done could be considered veridical. They did some interesting research on that. We told people in the study that we were looking at what helped projects go better and what impeded projects inside organizations. We wanted to understand that, which was true. We didn't tell them we were focusing on creativity. But if the person in the diary entry mentioned that they came up with a new idea, that they solved a complex problem in a new way, a non-rote way, we counted that as an example of creative thought that day. I believe that this is a conservative measure. I think that we can say that it's veridical if people did say that they solved a problem, if they actually did solve that problem that day. My guess is that it's underreported because we didn't tell them, we want to know about every problem you solve. We want to know about every new idea that you got. If they happen to mention that as their event of the day, it got counted as creative thought. So that's our quasi-behavioral measure of creativity, which I feel pretty solid about. It did significantly and positively correlate with peer ratings and actually with supervisor ratings as well of creativity. These were monthly ratings. So if someone was in the study for 9 months, at the end of, or 5, actually some were in the study for 9 months, at the end of every month, coworkers, close coworkers, and the supervisor were asked to assess the person's creative contributions to the project and so on. I think it's pretty impressive that there's any correlation at all between these measures because they're very different. One is inside the person's head and what they're reporting day by day, and the other is what's apparent, what's obvious to the coworkers and to the supervisor. So we use both of these measures as measures of creativity. And here's an example of creative thought. Working on the details of how the image will be produced, I really got into the problem and came up with an elegant method for dealing with overloaded tasks. And these are the analyses that we did. We did qualitative analysis of each creative thought event so that we could try to understand microscopically whether there was affect associated with these creative ideas, these creative thoughts, and to try to get some sense of the patterns that might be able to occur. We also did quantitative analyses, including regressions, trying to predict creativity from affect, trying to predict affect from creativity, including lagged analyses. One of the nice things about having day-by-day data from these people is that we were able to try to predict one day's creativity from the previous day's affect. And this was how we tried to establish directionality, if not strong causality. And we had a number of controls in our models. We looked at the form of the relationship by using squared terms to look at curvilinearity. Ambivalence was a dichotomous measure where if there were both segments that conveyed positive affect and segments that conveyed negative affect in the same diary story, we counted that as having ambivalent affect, that day as having ambivalent affect, okay, or not. And we had a number of different approaches for looking at lability change in affective state, including change from a negative state one day to a positive state the following day, vice versa. We looked at the absolute size of the change in affect because we had a scale rating on this. And we also looked at change specifically from below midpoint of the scale to above midpoint of the scale. So we had a number of different takes on that change question. So first of all, looking at the nature of the relationship, we found that creative thought was positively predicted by every measure of affect that we had. Same day coda-rated positive mood, self-rated mood, and joy, which was the key positive emotion that the coders coded from the diary story. Creative thought was negatively predicted by same-day negative emotions. All three of the negative emotions, anger, fear, and sadness, negatively predicted the incidence of creative thought on a given day. Monthly peer-rated creativity was positively predicted by self-rated positive mood. We found a little bit of evidence that negative affect could lead to creativity, but there were, I think, out of the database of 12,000 days, there were fewer than 20 instances of this. But there were a few where the person expressed frustration on a day that they came up with a creative idea. And it was almost always frustration with the problem itself, that they were struggling with something, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this yourself, struggling with something, struggling with it, and then, aha, it comes together. Okay. In terms of the form of the relationship, we found nothing but a linear pattern. And I should say that this is within the range of the data that we had. So I don't believe in these work situations that we got the depths of the most negative emotions that people can ever experience in their lives, or the heights of the most positive emotions people could ever experience. So this is a fairly limited range of affectivity, but within this range, we didn't find anything going on except a positive linear relationship. And was there a question over here?
Oh, yeah. I may have missed this, but I'm just curious about the peer-rated creativity, how you could do that while also intending to keep the concept of the creative thought measure unknown. Like you didn't, explicitly ask them to rate their own creative thought, and yet you had them review their peers.
We didn't have them review their peers' creative ideas. We had them just rate their peers. So the people participated in this in intact teams. So in each company we went into, we typically had 4 teams participating. The people within a team once a month would get a survey asking them to rate each other individual on the team in terms of creativity, as well as themselves actually, on creative contributions to the project over the prior month. So they didn't have access to the creative thoughts that we were finding in the diaries. They were just rating overall from having interacted with this person on the project team over the past month. here's what I say this person's creative contributions were on a 7-point scale. This person's a 2, or this person was a 6 over the past month. Does that help? So these are really very different measures that we had. But we got very similar results from those different measures. Okay. In terms of the temporal dynamics, we found that positive affect was an antecedent of creativity. We did this by using lagged analyses, and we found that when people, and the previous slide said that when people were in a more positive mood on a given day, they were more likely to come up with a creative idea that day. This says they were also more likely to come up with a creative idea the next day. And we had some evidence, not statistically significant, some evidence that it might actually even carry over to the day after that. So this is there's for a long time been talk of an incubation effect in creativity. In fact, Campbell's work talked about incubation. There were papers 100 years ago by people speculating on an incubation effect, and there is anecdotal evidence as well. It's been very difficult to demonstrate incubation in the laboratory. This is, to my knowledge, the first non-laboratory demonstration of an incubation effect for creativity specifically. There's been some demonstrations of an incubation effect for learning over a 24-hour period, but not for creativity in a naturalistic setting like this. So we're very excited about this incubation, this lagged effect that we discovered here. We also found no evidence of the opposite, no evidence that creativity on a given day predicts affect the next day. So from these lagged analyses, it was one direction only. But I've got something from our qualitative analyses that suggests the directionality does work the other way as well. Terry, did you have?
Yeah, just a more general question. Given that the timing isn't uniform, did you look at Mondays versus Fridays?
Yeah, we did. In terms of, you mean affect?
Like, you might say people are more creative on Mondays because they've had rest, or they're more creative on Fridays because they've been
We
involved.
did look at that. We didn't find anything. We thought that maybe there would be an across-the-week effect. We also, what's interesting is that we found this lagged effect whether or not we included the Friday to Monday, because that's a lot of time intervening, right? We actually found some evidence even there. I can tell you, this is not germane to what we're talking about right now, but we did find a time pressure effect through the week in terms of people's experienced time pressure, which was one of the things on the survey. We asked every day, how much time pressure did you perceive today? Time pressure is fairly low on Mondays. It builds to a crescendo on Thursday, and then it tends to decline on Friday. So, the 2 days bracketing the weekend tend to be lower time pressure, for what that's worth to me.
So it seems like there's various Stanford scales at which the effect is. So for instance, in the previous slide, we talked about how creativity and affect are positively correlated. So it seems like, at least for the same day, if you're creative, then you're also likely to be, say, roughly happier, right? And here it seems like if you're happier the previous day, then you're creative the next day. So
it's also same day effect. That's just the association, right, between affect and creativity. But let me get to the qualitative, because I think that there's something interesting here. We did find that, so affect is an antecedent of creativity. We're very confident about that. And Eisen's experimental work suggests the same thing. We wondered if maybe there really was an effect where if you come up with a creative idea, that will lead to joy, that will lead to happiness, elation, pride, whatever, but that it might not carry over to the next day, which could be why we're not picking it up in the lagged analyses. And there's some evidence in the emotion literature suggesting that emotions, especially the discrete emotions, tend to not last a very long time unless the event was spectacularly huge. And again, there wasn't much of that in the database that we had. So we thought maybe the emotion would decay by the end, certainly by the next day, by the next morning. and we might not see it, but we went into the qualitative data. We looked at what people wrote in these diaries, and we did find evidence that when people expressed having come up with a new idea or having solved a complex problem, they often expressed joy or elation, something like that. So we did, I thought I had an example of that, maybe not. Oh, this is it, yeah. So we did find that in 19 of the 26 teams, we found at least 1 or 2 instances where people expressed a lot of joy after having come up with a creative idea. And 86% of the reactions were positive. Not all of them, but most of them were positive like that. And here's an example. I felt relieved and happy. Somebody said, I'm all hyped. Ain't science wonderful? God, I love it when a plan comes together. This is the kind of thing that people would say. So it seemed pretty clear that unless these people were deluding themselves, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that they were, that creative activity often engenders positive affect. There were some negative affective emotions. I felt frustrated not knowing how to put a concept into manufacturing, or not having a lot of hope that the idea would receive a positive reception inside the organization. Okay, so that's direct consequence. We also found so positive affect seems to be associated consistently with creativity, across measures of affect, across measures of creativity. We found that affect does function as an antecedent, a direct consequence. We also found that it can be an indirect consequence, but usually it's a negative indirect consequence. So the pattern would be someone would come up with a creative idea, they would express it to others inside the organization, and the typical reaction was skeptical, at least in the organizations we were studying. Okay, and I guess that's partly the nature of professional work. You know, you want to be skeptical, you want to challenge new ideas, and then that would engender a negative affective response. So an indirect consequence of creative thought, at least if you expressed it to someone, was often negative. And we found evidence that when people were engaged in creative idea generation, if they were doing brainstorming with colleagues, or if they had a chunk of a day where they were trying to solve a complex problem and they were clearly engaged in creative thought, that there was often positive affectivity associated with that. And again, this came out of our qualitative analysis. So we think that affect is associated to creativity in all of these ways, as an antecedent, as a consequence, a direct consequence, as an indirect consequence, and as a concomitant. There was a hand up in the back, yes?
So do you find creativity to be sort of viral within the teams? If somebody came up with a sort of creative idea one day, did it sort of propagate to other people having a good effect the next day or having good ideas the next day?
So you're talking about sort of a contagion effect of the creative idea as well as of the emotionality. I don't know that we did specific analyses to look at that. There was distressingly little carryover from one day's stories to the next day's stories, even in the same individual. So it was sometimes like, are they working on the same thing? Is this the same person? Because many of these people were playing so many different roles in the teams that they were on. They had so many different kinds of events to report. Occasionally, I can think of some instances where we absolutely did see the kind of thing that you're talking about. So someone on a team would come up with an idea or solve a problem, and then the next day others would be working on it and trying to follow up on the idea. I can't remember instances where we saw emotional contagion from one person on one day to other people on the team the next day, if those people didn't also experience that same emotion the prior day.
Actually, not necessarily the next day, maybe the same day as well.
Yes. We saw many instances where different people on the same team would report the same incident that had happened in the team on that day, and usually the affective reactions were the same, but not always. And one of the things that we'd like to do is to go in and look at the contrast of these instances where everybody would have experienced the same thing in the same meeting, for example, and 60% of the people on the team would have had a positive reaction, and then the others would have had a very negative reaction, and that did happen sometimes. Steve, do you remember?
No, I think we can say, I can say with some certainty that there were negative contagions. So when somebody was really had something go wrong, we'd see that, I think. I mean, and you have toxic individuals as well as just situations that.
Yeah, there was a spread of negativity, and people would sometimes talk about each other in that way. You know, this person's really dragging me down or dragging the team down. Yeah. Was there another hint up? Yes.
So you mentioned brainstorming, and I was curious if you could talk about the team aspects of affects. So for example, in this you're looking at, does your own positive affects affect your own creativity? Is it true then that if someone else in your team or your team's average has a positive affect on a particular day, is that associated with creativity?
We did try to look at that. One of my co-authors on this paper, by the way, the paper was published in Administrative Science Quarterly in 2005. One of my co-authors is Sigal Barsaid, who's at the Wharton School. And one of the things that she's gotten pretty well known for the last few years, Leslie, is studying emotional contagion. So she was very interested in using these data to look at that. I don't know if we didn't have the right kind of data, but we didn't find a lot of evidence of that. There was, as Steve described, some qualitative evidence of that, but we weren't able to get it out of the numbers that we had in people's affective self-reports day by day. So this is I will only leave this up for a minute or so. This is a schematic that captures the various connections that we found in this study, supplemented by what comes out of the literature. So that was looking at one element of inner work life, emotion, and one aspect of performance, creativity. We did similar analyses with other aspects of inner work life and other dimensions of performance, and we basically found that every dimension of inner work life, emotion, perceptions, and intrinsic motivation is associated with every dimension of performance. And by expected directions, I mean more positive inner work life associated with higher levels of performance. So I'm going to move on to the second research question. I'm going to zip through this in hopes of maybe getting a little bit to the third research question. So this is, if inner work life makes a difference for performance, what makes a difference for inner work life? How do events at work, day by day, kind of at a microscopic level, influence how people feel at work emotionally? How intrinsically motivated they are, how jazzed they are about doing their work, how engaged in their work, and how do events influence their perceptions of the organization, their coworkers, and their work. There isn't much prior literature, so I've cited up here pretty much everything that exists previously on this. There's some theoretical work suggesting that, well, yes, what happens at work should influence how people feel and how well they perform, but not a lot of detail in that theory. Weiss and Crapanzano's affective events theory specifically says we don't know much about what influences day-by-day affective experience inside organizations. There were a few empirical studies that had some tantalizing results. These were diary studies, but virtually every diary study done before ours used closed-ended questions, didn't ask people to actually write about their day, but instead would, for example, give people checklists of events. Did this happen today? Did that happen today? Did that happen? And they would just check off events that happened. So it was up to the researchers to decide, okay, I think these are important events that could happen in work life, I think these are important events that could happen in personal life, and we'll just ask people if they happened. And almost all of these diary studies lasted 2 weeks or less. So at the end of the day, people would be asked to take out the diaries. But there were some intriguing results. So David and colleagues, James David and his colleagues, in 1997 published a paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology where they had about 100 men fill out a daily diary questionnaire at the end of each day. This was a checklist. It included not only a checklist of events, but also measures of the person's affect that day, their end-of-day mood. And they found that the single biggest predictor of end-of-day positive mood was the incidence of desirable events at work. And the single biggest predictor of negative mood was the incidence of negative events at work rather than personal life. Okay, so this suggests at least that work life looms large in people's day-by-day affective experience in their life. Yeah, Scott.
What you just said gets at my question largely. I'm curious if you delete the word work from this literature and you say, well, the literature on inner work life may be small. Presumably the literature on inner life is larger. And does the literature, if that's true, does that literature apply to work?
So you know what? It's not true. There actually isn't much. I don't know of a study like ours that just followed people for a long period of time, day by day, looking at free response reports of what happened in their day and coding those. And we developed a very detailed, very elaborate coding scheme to try to capture basically every kind of event that these people reported happening to them. There certainly is some. You might know of Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow. We were inspired by his experience sampling methodology, which he developed back in the 70s. You probably recognize that our diary method is a version of that. Rather than beeping people several times a day for a couple of weeks, we had them do something once a day for several months. But it was kind of similar. And in some of his studies, he uses open-ended reports. Many of them, it's not a very rich and thick description of exactly what was happening.
Yeah, the day-by-day is an interesting question for me. I was thinking about the Steve Jobs School of Management, which says if you give people huge negative emotional jolts, profane, on a regular basis, they may be sad today, but in the long run, they'll up their performance.
If they don't leave.
If they don't leave.
Yeah, right. I get asked about Steve Jobs almost every time I give a talk, either to an academic audience or a business audience on this, because of the results that I just presented, right? Positive affect associated with creativity. Well, how can you account for Jobs, abusing employees emotionally and getting, very high levels of performance out of his employees? My belief is that they were innovative, creative, and productive despite this treatment and not because of it. I do think that there was something Jobs was doing that partly manifested itself in this verbal abuse that actually was positive, and that was his extreme passion for what he was doing, what they were doing as a group. I think he is maybe the best example I've ever heard of someone who can convey a sense of mission, of being on a mission in doing something really important, making a huge difference. At least he's the best famous example that I know of. That can carry people a long way. And I think when I get to the end of this particular research question, number 2, you'll see that meaning in the work, that sense of purpose in the work, can make a huge difference. Okay, so our aims here were to try to overcome the limitations of prior research, looking at how weather and how events in the day can affect affective experience and motivation. Hopefully in close to real time, by examining in great detail what these people were reporting and connecting to the data that we had on inner work life. So our first attempt at looking at this was to look at differences between people's very best inner work-life days and their very worst inner work-life days. Now, were there differences in the kinds of events that were occurring? And what were the events that seemed to be the highest impact, or at least to show up the most frequently in the best days and the worst days? So what we did was to create a baseline for each individual, their baseline affect over the many weeks and months that we were studying them, and give them a z-score for each day's affect relative to their own baseline. We did the same for intrinsic motivation and the other aspects of inner work life. And then out of the entire database, we chose samples of for example, the very highest positive affect or positive mood days and the very lowest. And the very highest days of intrinsic motivation and the very lowest days of intrinsic motivation. And we, in detail, went through and coded all of the events that were occurring on those days. And we also chose samples of average affect days, so z-score 0. We chose random samples of days that were average in affect, intrinsic motivation, and so on. We also, and as I said, we micro-coded these subsets of events for every aspect of everything that was going on. We used an alternative sampling technique that yielded identical results for us, and that was, rather than just sampling days out of the entire database of 12,000 days, we sampled individuals and took the individual's very best day, very worst day, and an average day. Okay? So these were the primary positive events that we found on the very best days. And these are presented in the order of frequency with which they occurred on the best days. And I won't read these, I'll just give you a second to take a look at them. Now the graph that I'm going to show you is a simple bar graph that has a bar for each of these for the incidence of these events on the best days. So the first one you'll see will be progress, and you'll see that it's at 76%. 76% of the very best days had a progress event reported. And that is where the individual or the team moved forward in the work that they were doing. Next, what you'll see a bar depicting the incidence of progress events on the very worst days. The graph I'm going to show you doesn't include average days, just for simplicity, but I can tell you that the average days were generally intermediate between the best and the worst days. And these are ordered in terms of the size of the gap between the best days and the worst days. This is for overall mood, the overall mood measure, but the results for the other measures of inner work life are pretty similar. So you can see that the biggest differentiator in terms of absolute frequency of events occurring is progress. Biggest differentiator between the best and the worst days. On this graph, these are all positive events that occurred. Receiving instrumental support, and that is support for progress in the work. So progress and support for progress loom large on the best days. They're very, very frequent. Interpersonal support makes a difference. So feeling encouraged by your coworkers or your supervisors, getting some kind of recognition for your work, that makes a difference as well. What's interesting is average days were intermediate between the best and the worst, except for interpersonal support. The average days was almost identical to the worst days. So when interpersonal support happened, tended to make it a pretty good day. Yes?
Why do you suppose the graph sort of mirrors, like why do they, like on the good day and the bad day, like the same, see what I'm saying, like how the good days and bad days mirror each other in terms of the...
Well, these are all positive events, so we would expect them to occur more frequently on the best days than the worst days. What's interesting to me is that that's not true of collaboration, right? Now, these were all project teams, and so it's maybe a function of the kind of work that we were studying, But these people worked with each other quite a bit. So they did collaborate with others. They did work with others much of the time. But this is kind of like, and actually average days was lower here. Collaboration occurred less frequently on the average days than on the best or the worst days. And I summarize this with the complex theory called people, you can't live with them, you can't live without them. They can either make a day really good or really, really bad. And if you're on your own, maybe it's sort of more stable. Yes.
I don't know what the average is, but the way I interpret this graph is necessary but not really sufficient conditions for a good day. And it seems like it is really necessary to make progress on a good day, but collaboration happens all the time,
Yeah.
so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. Let me get to the worst days. These are the main negative events that were reported on the worst days, and this is in terms of the frequency that they showed up on the worst days. You can see that many of these are just the exact opposite of what showed up on the best days. So setbacks, the opposite of progress. Lack of instrumental support, lack of interpersonal support. In fact, the top three there are the exact same top three as on the best days, but these are just the negative form. And when you look at the graph, you see essentially a mirror image. So progress and setbacks and support for progress, or lack of support, are huge. Okay, those are the number one and number two categories in differentiating best days from worst days. So we wondered if this is obvious to managers. Oh, okay, I'm not going to go through this, but we basically found similar effects when we analyzed all 12,000 days. We found that progress and setbacks were very important in predicting inner work life. We also found that the setback effect sizes were larger, so negative events do tend to have a more powerful impact on people's psychological experience than the similar opposite positive events. This is a general finding in psychology. There's an interesting paper by Roy Baumeister and some of his colleagues a few years ago called Bad is Stronger Than Good. And I recommend that paper to you if you'd like to look at this more. We also found that even small events, even small steps forward can make a big difference in people's affective states. So even small events, and I don't have time to describe how we size the event, but events that even seem trivial could engender enormously positive reactions if they were progress events, or negative reactions if they were setback events. And these are the kinds of things that support progress. These are those instrumental supports broken down when we categorized more finely what they were. These are kind of obvious good management techniques, right? These are the kinds of things a good manager should do. And in terms of the interpersonal supports, again, nothing enormously surprising here. So we wondered if managers know this stuff already. Do managers know about the important motivational power of making progress in meaningful work? And this gets back to the question that Terry asked earlier. We found that if people made progress on work that they considered trivial, unimportant, they couldn't see a purpose to it, this progress principle did not apply. So getting a lot done on something you didn't care about really didn't matter. So the work has to be meaningful. There has to be some sense of contributing to something that you value. We wondered if managers knew about the motivational power of progress. So after we finished the diary study, we gave a survey to 669 managers. These were not people involved in the original study at all. And they represented companies from around the world, a variety of industries, a lot of different companies. And the survey had just a very simple question. Here are 5 management tools, we said, rank them in terms of how important you think they are in influencing employee motivation, and then a second set of questions asked influencing employee emotion. So we included making progress in the work, because that's what came out of our study. And we also included 4 motivators and 4 employee influencers from the management canon. Things like incentives and recognition. And what we found was that this is not at all obvious to managers. In fact, it was ranked last. Progress was ranked dead last by these 669 managers. And only 5% of them ranked progress number 1. Now you saw how much more prominent progress was than any of those other events. If these guys were making their choices randomly, 20% of them should have chosen progress as the most important motivator, right? But they didn't. Only 5% did. So it seems like this is not something that's top of mind for managers, and it's certainly not something that's top of mind when they're actually in there managing people day by day. Because of the 7 companies that we studied, there was only one where we saw managers at all levels, from the team leader level on up to the top, consistently supporting progress, consistently providing those instrumental supports day by day and week by week. Only one. And of the 26 teams, there were only 6 teams, 4 in that one company and 2 in a couple of other companies. So this may not be rocket science, but it's big news to most managers. So I'm going to end there. Maybe we'll have a couple of minutes for questions, but I want to say that we're exploring a number of avenues now for experimentally getting at what really might be going on here, but also trying to look at ways of helping managers be more aware of supporting progress every day. And I was interested during our HCI lunch to learn that many of you are working on checklists, checklists to help surgical teams, for example, checklists to help other people. One of the things that we're doing is looking at the possibility of a daily management checklist, a daily progress support or inner work life support checklist, to help people just be aware of watching out for what their direct reports need to be able to make meaningful progress on meaningful work day by day. So I'm going to end there, and I think we might have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes?
So you said time pressure tended to increase up until Thursday. So I was wondering, because of the fact that time pressure wasn't, like if there was 50% on the best days and 60% on the bad days, so there was no evidence that on like Thursdays people were happier, like happiness.
Yeah, time pressure is one of the most interesting factors that we studied, because we found that the optimal level of time pressure for creativity looks like it's sort of low to moderate time pressure, but not really low time pressure and not really high time pressure. We found that the most common form of time pressure, so I think that's why we didn't find any simple linear effects here. The most common form of time pressure in organizations is where people feel like they're running on a treadmill all day, and they're getting maybe a lot done, but most of it is unplanned work or work that's not actually on their to-do list for their most important projects. They're just doing a lot of other stuff during the day. We call that running on a treadmill, right? Because they're not really getting anywhere on their most important work. That may actually be good for productivity in terms of just getting a lot of stuff done, but it's pretty deadly for creativity. We found creativity happening very, very rarely when people had days like that. There's one kind of time pressure that can be positive, and that's what we call being on a mission, where you believe that you're working on something that's urgently and importantly necessary, right? You understand why it needs to be done now, and you buy into that, and importantly, you are protected from distractions, from other demands on your time, or you protect yourself. Under those conditions, we did see high levels of creativity under high time pressure, but those conditions almost never exist inside organizations. Okay? It's just very rare for people to set up something like that. So I think we'll end the formal session here. I will hang around for a few minutes to talk with you informally. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.